2 years ago in Florida, a 16-year-old vampire, Rod Ferrell, from the nearby state of Kentucky.
It began with a handful of teenagers who thought they'd found something extraordinary. A boy who claimed to be a 500-year-old vampire, promising them eternal life. But within weeks, that fantasy turned to horror. 2 parents were dead, their daughter missing, and the self-proclaimed vampire was on the run. This is the story of how a group of ordinary kids turned their dream of immortality into a nightmare.
I had decided to take the darker path, the evil path. I found that more exciting. And I was willing to go the distance to see what that side held.
The making of a monster. Roderick Ferrell was just 6 years old when darkness began to take shape in his world. Murray, Kentucky, was a quiet town, one of those places where neighbors waved from their porches and kids rode bikes until sundown. But behind the curtains of one home, something far more sinister was brewing. It started as fascination, then obsession, until fantasy and reality became indistinguishable. By the time he was 16, Rod would lead what he called a family bound not by blood, but by ritual, and it would all end in bloodshed. He became the youngest person in the United States ever sentenced to death. Roderick Justin Ferrell entered the world in March of 1980. His parents were teenagers, barely adults themselves, when he was born. His father soon enlisted in the military, leaving Rod in the care of his mother, Sandra Gibson.
And he didn't speak to Rod at all. He called him the child, is what he called him. And Rod cried really bad. That's the only time he cried.
Their lives drifted from one temporary home to another. A small apartment here, a trailer there, and sometimes his grandparents' house when money ran out. Behind closed doors, though, the picture was far from ordinary. Court records later revealed that Rod claimed his grandfather had abused him when he was just 5 years old. No charges were ever filed, but the accusation left scars, whether real or imagined, that would echo for years. Sandra struggled to make ends meet. She danced at local clubs and occasionally turned to sex work to keep food on the table. It was a life on the margins, unstable, uncertain, and filled with shadows. To young Roderick, the world felt cruel and unpredictable. The line between affection and exploitation, between family and fear, blurred before he even learned what those words meant. Those early years shaped the boy who would one day call himself immortal. But in the beginning, he was just a lonely child, searching for belonging in a world that had already abandoned him.
So I always did wonder what it would be like to sit in it and actually experience death through it. So that part doesn't really bother me at all.
The life Sandra and Rod shared was one of constant motion and quiet decay. They moved from one temporary home to another, sometimes sleeping under the same roof as Sandra's parents, sometimes in public housing where the walls were thin and the nights felt longer. Each move carried the same undercurrent of instability, as if they were always running from something that couldn't be named. From an early age, Sandra drew her son into the dark corners of her own imagination. What began as harmless fascination, with Dracula films flickering on late-night television and paperback novels from Vampire, The Masquerade stacked on the nightstand.
So I always did wonder what it would be like to sit in it and actually experience death through it. So that part doesn't really bother me at all.
Slowly became something else. The fantasy of eternal life, of power over pain, began to seep into reality. It became their shared language, their secret world. But the bond between them was anything but healthy. Sandra blurred the lines between mother and confidant, protector and participant. Rod would later describe their relationship as complicated, a word that barely scratched the surface. In their small, dimly lit bedroom, Sandra allowed her son to build an altar, a shrine to darkness, complete with inverted crosses, animal skulls, and candles that burned until morning. On the floor of her own room, she painted a pentagram. It wasn't play acting anymore. It was ritual. Rod's fascination with pain and power grew unchecked. He stopped going to school. He began cutting himself, small offerings of blood in search of meaning. Instead of seeking help, Sandra looked away, or perhaps encouraged it. Her behavior grew more erratic.
And of course, his mom was this big freak anyways, and she thinks that I'm trying to control her son, and I was like, no one can control Rod, okay? Not even you.
She began mingling with Rod's teenage friends, crossing boundaries that should never have been approached. Court records later revealed that she'd been placed on probation for attempting to seduce a 14-year-old boy under the pretense of a vampire initiation. Even then, she seemed more enraptured by the myth than the damage it caused.
Jaden and a guy that goes by the name of Bones came up to the house. Me and Rob was home alone, and I could tell something was up.
And yes, among those in Rod's orbit was a teenager named Stephen Murphy. The boy Sandra believed had turned her son into a vampire. Murphy later testified that the ritual had taken place 2 years earlier in a cemetery under a black Kentucky sky. They'd cut their arms, pressed the wounds together, and drank from each other's blood. For them, it wasn't symbolic, it was a covenant.
I mean, I look to Jaden more as a father figure. I was with Jaden and the Jaden family for a few months. He had indoctrinated me into the vampiric way of life. He had taught me the true ways of it.
The ceremony was only the beginning. Over time, these rituals became routine, a secret act repeated again and again, binding them tighter with each drop of blood. What started as fantasy was mutating into belief, and in that belief, Rod Ferrell was beginning to see himself as something beyond human.
Because we get to where most people dream about. The capabilities that we have, and that we're able to accomplish and stuff. So these people that, dream of being able to read people's minds and stuff like that, we actually can achieve that.
The Vampire Clan. As Sandra grew older, her obsession only deepened. She was 34 now, but still spent her nights in candlelit rooms playing at Immortality. She and Rod joined others in elaborate nocturnal gatherings, half role-playing, half ritual, where they spoke of clans, blood bonds, and ancient lineages. The games went on until dawn, long after reason had gone to sleep. For Rod, it was a rehearsal for the life he wanted to believe in. For Sandra, it blurred the last lines of motherhood entirely.
They made no secret of their beliefs. Their trademark black outfits and rumors of their blood-drinking, drug-taking, and sexual rituals soon made Rod and Jaden notorious in the small Kentucky town.
Then came the letters. When police eventually uncovered them, they read less like correspondence and more like confession. Sandra had been writing love notes to a 14-year-old boy, letters laced with longing, calling him her dark angel. They were evidence not only of her instability, but of a home that had lost all boundaries. The affection between mother and son, already twisted by their shared fantasies, now existed in the same space as deceit, obsession, and shame. In 1990, Sandra's parents left Kentucky and settled in Eustis, Florida. For a time, Sandra and Rod drifted between states, sometimes staying with the grandparents, sometimes moving back north. It was in Florida that Rod met Heather Wendorf, a quiet sophomore with a streak of rebellion and a growing resentment toward her parents. Heather didn't see the warnings others did. She saw a boy who seemed fearless, a boy who spoke of secret powers and eternal life when she felt trapped in suburbia. When Rod returned to Kentucky, he called Heather constantly, collect calls that ran up enormous phone bills until her parents finally cut him off. Heather was furious. What they didn't realize was that by then, Rod wasn't just some troubled teen on the phone. He was already shaping himself into something else. Back home in Murray, he began to build his following. To those around him, he was no longer Roderick Farrell. He was Vesago, the 500-year-old vampire, the soldier. He wore long coats, spoke in riddles about darkness and destiny, and carried himself like someone who believed his own myth. One by one, the outsiders found him. There was Howard Scott Anderson, 16, raised in a house ruled by an alcoholic father and nightly violence. Rod offered him brotherhood, a family that couldn't hurt him. Then came Charity Kesey, a fragile, lonely girl searching for connection anywhere it might exist. She found it in Rod's strange charisma, in his promise that pain could be transcended through ritual and blood. They became a clan. Not just friends, not just kids playing a game. To them, this was sacred. They believed they'd found something bigger than themselves, something powerful, eternal. None of them knew it yet, but that faith would soon lead them down a path that would end in horror. Dana Cooper was one of the last to be pulled into Rod Farrell's orbit. To outsiders, she was quiet, awkward, the kind of girl who never seemed entirely at ease in her own skin. But in Rod's stories, tales of immortality, of transcending pain through darkness, she found something intoxicating. He spoke of a life beyond judgment, a place where broken souls like hers could finally belong. To Dana, that sounded a lot like salvation.
I became close because of their feelings towards me. So I was willing to go the distance for them.
By the fall of 1996, the group's fantasy had curdled into something far darker. What had begun as harmless rebellion, costumes, rituals, whispered oaths, was now bleeding into reality. The first real sign came in October, when the Murray-Calloway County Animal Shelter reported a break-in. 2 puppies were found dead, their small bodies mutilated in ways too disturbing to describe. To the townspeople, it was unthinkable. To investigators, it felt like a message.
He goes, "See that tree?" Grabs it and then goes, wham, slams it right into the tree and killed the cat. That's when I started, pulling back away from him. Our friendship basically dwindled.
When police traced the vandalism back to a group of local teens, Rod Farrell's name appeared again and again. He was arrested and charged with burglary, trespassing, and animal cruelty. For most, that would have been the end. A wake-up call, a line not to be crossed. But for Rod, it only solidified his mythology. He told friends that what they'd done was a test of loyalty, a sacrifice to the darkness that watched over them. He wasn't just pretending anymore, he believed.
And I confronted the sheriff himself about it. I said, "You're looking for me about this. I didn't do it. I can prove I didn't do it. I was evil incarnate to them before this, and now I'm just Satan himself, so."
After that night, the group's gatherings took on a different tone. What used to feel like role play became ritual, private, secretive, and increasingly extreme. They met in a decaying structure hidden deep in the Kentucky woods, a place they called the Vampire Hotel. The building had long been abandoned, its floors warped with rot, and its walls stained by time. But to them, it was sacred ground. There, beneath the heavy canopy of the trees and the scent of mold and candle wax, they drank blood, whispered incantations, and made promises they couldn't possibly understand. Each ritual bound them closer, not just to Rod, but to the illusion that they were untouchable, immortal even. But reality was closing in. The police knew their names now. Parents were growing suspicious. And yet, instead of retreating, Rod pushed forward, pulling his followers deeper into a world that blurred fantasy and murder until there was no line left at all.
Beings, okay? A figment of somebody's imagination, written up in a book that's been made into a cult by kids who think trips on acid like the 70s isn't good enough.
In the decaying walls of the so-called Vampire Hotel, the night seemed to stretch on forever. The air was heavy with incense and candle smoke, the ground littered with broken glass and burnt-out matches. There, Rod and his followers surrendered themselves completely to heat, to trance, to delusion. They took hallucinogens and spoke in riddles about forgotten gods, about blood as a doorway to something higher. The line between the living and the dead no longer felt real. The forest around them seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, as if it too had become part of their ritual. By late November 1996, fantasy was collapsing into something irreversible. Rod had been telling them that a new life awaited, a rebirth. Not here in Kentucky, but in New Orleans, where they would start again as an immortal clan. He spoke of destiny, of freedom, of leaving behind everything that had hurt them, and they believed him.
At that time, they saw me as their vampiric father. When they needed guidance, they came to me. I became close because of their feelings towards me.
That November, he gathered his closest followers, his girlfriend, Charity Kesey, his best friend Howard Scott Anderson, and 19-year-old Dana Cooper, and told them it was time. Their destination, Eustis, Florida. Their mission, to rescue 16-year-old Heather Wendorf from what she claimed was an abusive home. To Rod, she wasn't just another follower. She was a symbol, his lost princess trapped in a mortal prison. He promised to save her, to deliver her into his eternal family.
I called Heather up and I said, look, either you join us or not. And well, that's when the plans for the night had begun.
As they drove through the night, the roads stretched endlessly before them, cutting through dark woods and forgotten towns. Anderson's car hummed low under the weight of their plans. They talked about New Orleans, about finding others like them, about feeding when they arrived. Somewhere between hallucination and hope, they convinced themselves this was fate. When they finally reached Eustis, the car gave out, a mechanical failure that stranded them miles from the house. Still, Rod took it as a sign. They walked the rest of the way in the thick, humid air of a Florida night, stopping only once to finalize their plan. Heather would leave with them willingly. She'd even give them her family's car to make their escape.
In the shower, and the daddy was laying in the family room on the couch. After circling the whole house, they entered the garage area, which is to our left, the left of the house. He decided to look for a little better weapon, and in doing so, they found a short crowbar.
To Rod, this was divine intervention, the final step in his transformation from outcast to leader, from boy to myth. He believed he was saving her. He couldn't see that what he was really leading them into was destruction. By the time Heather slipped him the keys to her family's home, the night had already turned. A pact had been made, one sealed not by blood this time, but by intent. Within hours, the fantasy that had kept them alive would twist into something far more tangible. And for two people asleep inside that Eustis house, it would be their final night alive. The night of rebirth. The night was heavy with humidity, the kind that clings to the skin and makes every breath feel thick. In the cemetery on the edge of Eustis, under a faint slice of moonlight, Rod prepared for what he called a rebirth. The others stood in a loose circle, their faces pale in the glow of candles half buried in the dirt. To them, this was sacred, an initiation, a moment of transformation.
And as I was heading back to the parents' bedroom, looking for the Explorer keys,
Rod had taken several tabs of LSD, and the world around him pulsed in slow waves. The trees seemed alive, whispering their approval. Heather stood before him, trembling but resolute. She had agreed to join them, to leave her family, her life, everything behind, and in return, Rod promised her eternity. With the blade of a razor, he sliced a thin line across his forearm. Dark blood welled up. Heather leaned in, pressing her lips to the cut, tasting iron, sealing the pact. It was just before dawn when they left the cemetery, their clothes damp with dew and adrenaline. Rod said the ritual had bound them together forever, but before they could escape to New Orleans, they needed a car, and Heather knew exactly where to get one.
Rod and Scott made their way into the house on foot. The girls, Heather, Charity, and Dana, remained in the car.
The Wendorf home sat quiet, tucked at the end of a cul-de-sac, lights out, the stillness of early morning hanging over it. Rod and Howard Scott Anderson slipped inside through a side window leading from the garage. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and citrus cleaner. Richard Wendorf, Heather's father, was asleep on the couch, shoes off, television still murmuring in the background.
They then entered through the garage into a little washroom and went down past the couch where the father was lying.
At first, Rod claimed he wanted only the car keys, that no one was supposed to get hurt. But as he stood over the sleeping man, something shifted. Later, he said it felt like another presence had taken hold, a surge of power or madness or both. Anderson would remember it more plainly. That's when Rod went crazy.
He didn't notice me. Scott followed right behind me as fast as he could and as quiet as he could, because he had the TV pretty much cranked. It was as he started to turn around, I saw he was coming out, and I just boom.
Without a word, Rod lifted the crowbar. The first blow landed with a sound that didn't seem human. Then another, and another. Blood sprayed across the walls, the couch, the framed photos of smiling faces. Each strike came harder than the last until the shape beneath him stopped moving altogether. The force of the assault was so violent that teeth scattered across the carpet, later cataloged by police as evidence of what pure, unrestrained fury looks like.
While he was cool, I figured now or never, because if he gets up, I'm a So I just beat him until he died.
In the bathroom down the hall, 54-year-old Ruth Wendorf was finishing her shower, unaware that her husband was already gone. She had spent her life volunteering at the local high school, the kind of woman neighbors waved to on their morning walks. As she toweled off, she heard something. Maybe a creak, maybe nothing at all. When she stepped into the hallway, the sound of water still dripping behind her, she came face to face with the horror her daughter had unknowingly unleashed.
I asked her, I said, since you've spoken so much about killing your parents over the past year, I was like, do you still want me to?
And what did she say?
Ruth saw Rod Farrell standing in her kitchen with a crowbar in his hands and something dark on his face. She grabbed the nearest thing, her coffee cup, and hurled the hot liquid at him, an act of instinct, of survival. It stung his skin. It did not stop him.
That's whenever her mom came out through the kitchen area, and she started to lunge at me. She spilled her coffee on me, went all over me, and then she clawed my face and grabbed my wrist, and that's when I took the...
Ruth fought as if the very act of struggling could reopen the world to ordinary hours and ordinary mornings. Her hands and arms carried the map of that resistance, cuts and bruises, marks that later, in a courtroom, would be cataloged as proof she had tried to live. Rod's face and neck bore the counter-signature of that fight, scratches that said someone had clawed back. Neighbors who later described Ruth remembered a woman who would not surrender easily. In those last frantic moments, she tried to run, to reach a door, to carve a path between herself and the impossible. He met her in the hallway. The blows that followed were brutal and relentless. The living room became a place where time narrowed to the sound of impact and the metallic ring of a crowbar meeting bone. When it ended, the house was left with the kind of silence that has its own weight, a silence that could not be counted as peaceful.
And
So where'd you hit her first? In the back of the head or in front of the head? You said? Right there? Okay.
I only hit her once right there. All the rest of the time was back here. You'll notice in the pictures, the big hole.
Rod would later tell investigators he had not intended for the night to end this way. He would say words meant to explain madness, compulsion, an absence of control, phrases that tried to make the unthinkable legible. Anderson, who had been there, would later offer a single, stunned line that was made testimony. That's when Rod went crazy. It was the plainest explanation anyone could find for the moment a boy crossed an unreturnable line. What remained? In the days after, the physical traces told a story the witnesses could not stomach in full. A house upended, personal items spattered and scattered, a family's ordinary life translated into evidence bags and photographs. Investigators found the scratches on Rod's skin, the defensive wounds on Ruth's hands, the crowbar with its dull, new weight. Each mark became a ledger entry, a piece of paper that would be read under oath and in fluorescent light. But the facts, bruises, scratches, a broken life, were only one layer. Below them lay the quieter, deeper violence of betrayal. The daughter who had trusted, the mother who had been unsuspecting in her own home, the ordinary human moments, coffee in the morning, a television left on that had been turned into the scene of a crime. That betrayal is what the neighborhood could not forgive, what the courtrooms and headlines struggled to name. What remained was not a neat story with a tidy ending, but a raw question about how fantasy and neglect could collude to make monsters of boys who should have become men. Anderson stood by, frozen in the thick quiet that follows violence. He did not run, did not help, did not stop anything. Instead, when the house fell silent again, the two began moving methodically through it. They stepped over the bodies, their shoes leaving faint prints in blood as they searched for the keys to the family's Ford Explorer. Every drawer was opened, every counter swept clean of loose bills and coins. What began as slaughter turned into scavenging.
When they got back here on the road, a couple of the girls described Farrell had on a greenish type t-shirt, and it was covered with blood, and there was blood on his face and such. And then that's when they pulled around the corner and changed the tags and left the area.
Later, Rod would describe what he felt in those moments. It wasn't guilt, it wasn't fear, it was euphoria. He told investigators it felt like being a god, that in the aftermath he felt invincible, as though he had reached a kind of power no one else could understand. That sense of control, of dominance over life and death, was what thrilled him most. To him, this wasn't murder. It was a transformation. The night Jennifer Wendorf came home, she wasn't thinking about anything extraordinary, just the small anxieties of a teenage life, coming in late, hoping her parents were asleep, rehearsing excuses in her head. She'd stayed out past curfew again, and all she wanted was to slip through the front door, up the stairs and into bed before anyone noticed. The house was quiet, dark except for the soft flicker of a lamp in the living room. Her father was there, slumped on the couch. In the half-light, he looked like he dozed off watching TV. She didn't think twice. She moved carefully toward the kitchen, the old floorboards creaking under her feet. Then, in a single breath, everything ordinary shattered. On the floor, between the kitchen and the dining room, was her mother, motionless, face down, the tile beneath her slick and red. For a moment, Jennifer couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. The coffee cup on the counter, the faint hum of the refrigerator, her mother's hair matted with blood, it all existed at once, too real and too impossible. The phone slipped in her shaking hands as she dialed 911. Her voice wavered between gasps and half-sentences. She tried to explain, tried to make words fit around what her eyes refused to accept. The operator could barely understand her through the sobs. There was a pause, a quiet on the line, when Jennifer realized she didn't know where her father was anymore.
That Heather had told her that she was a vampire and that she read novels about vampires, and at one time she saw a witch's Bible in her room.
By then, Rod and his followers were already gone. The stolen Ford Explorer tore down the Florida backroads, heading north toward the promise of New Orleans. They left behind nothing but ruin, a family destroyed, a town that would never forget their names.
He despised his family, he despised his life. He despised life, period. He felt he was trapped on this earth. This is his...
The fall of the Vampire King. To this day, people still argue about what Heather Wendorf knew. Some say she was just a desperate teenager, manipulated by someone who told her everything she wanted to hear. Others believe she must have sensed what was coming, that somewhere inside her she knew this rescue was a lie.
And I find there's probable cause to detain you.
15-year-old Heather Wendorf arrested. Her sister had indicated in statements to investigators.
What is known is that when Rod pulled up to meet her that night, his hands and clothes were stained dark. There was blood on his arms, on the fabric of his coat, and in that instant, Heather understood. Whatever story she had told herself about freedom, about escape, had died in that house with her parents.
Charging you with first-degree murder. And I find there's probable cause to detain you.
Later, Rod would insist there had been no plan, no intent to kill, that the violence came over him suddenly, without thought. But those who saw the crime scene knew better. They saw the ritual marks, the care he took, and what he left behind. It wasn't a moment of madness. It was the culmination of everything he had built, the delusion, the power, the fantasy of being more than human. And now, there was no going back.
I mean, if it wouldn't have been the Wendorfs, at the rate I was going, it would have been somebody, if not more people.
Rod would later insist that Dana Cooper and Charity Kesey had no idea what he intended that night, that they had simply dropped him off, innocent of what would follow. But even that explanation wavered under scrutiny. Every version he told seemed to shift depending on who was listening. Sometimes Heather was a victim, sometimes a co-conspirator. He said she had talked about her parents' cruelty, about wanting to be free, but police and family friends knew that wasn't true. The Wendorfs weren't perfect, but there was no evidence of abuse, only the ordinary friction of adolescence.
In this regard, we find that there is no longer probable cause to believe that Heather Wendorf was a knowing participant in the terrible acts that occurred at her home.
Still, Rod's claim never changed, that Heather knew more than she admitted, that she had consented in silence to the idea of her parents' deaths. Whether that was truth or manipulation, no one could ever prove.
I asked her, I said, since you've spoken so much about killing your parents over the past year, I was like, do you still want me to?
And what did she say?
3 days after the murders, a deputy in Seminole County spotted an abandoned Buick near the Central Florida Zoo. The plates traced back to the Wendorf's stolen Explorer, and within hours a bee on the lookout went out across state lines. The net was tightening. By then, Rod and his followers were in Baton Rouge. They had been on the road for days, dirty, hungry, and exhausted. Their grand escape to New Orleans had dissolved into wandering. No money, no food, and nowhere left to go. Charity finally broke. She called her grandmother in South Dakota, begging for help. The older woman listened, calm and careful, and told her to stay put at a Howard Johnson's nearby. She would wire money soon, she promised. Instead, she called the police. When officers surrounded the motel, there was no resistance. The so-called Kentucky Vampire Clan didn't fight, didn't flee. They were led out one by one, quiet and pale beneath the motel's neon sign. The fantasy was over.
About 10:30 this evening, all 5 were arrested in Baton Rouge, Louisiana at a motel.
Was the car nearby?
Yes, the vehicle, the Wendorf's Ford Explorer was there.
In the Baton Rouge jail, Rod Farrell talked freely, too freely. He confessed to everything with an unsettling calm, describing the murders in exact, gory detail as if he were narrating someone else's story. There was no tremor in his voice, no hint of remorse. If anything, there was pride. He smiled through the retelling, savoring the attention, the shock, the power it still gave him. To the detectives watching, it was clear he hadn't just killed 2 people. He had built an entire mythology around it. Rod wasn't trying to hide his crimes. He was trying to immortalize them.
I had decided to take the darker path, the evil path. I found that more exciting.
When Rod Farrell finally faced the courtroom, it was as if the walls themselves were his stage. He smirked through proceedings, tossing out sarcastic remarks to reporters and exchanging taunts with onlookers. Cameras captured his every move, his defiant grin, his exaggerated sneer, the way he stuck out his tongue during photo ops, as if mocking the very system that would soon decide his fate. To him, the trial was just another performance in a story he had written himself.
I think your family failed you. I think society failed you. But I also am here to tell you, in the considered judgment of this court, a troubled and disturbed youth cannot serve as an excuse for cold-blooded, premeditated murder.
Yet, when his trial began on February 5th, 1998, everything changed. The smirk stopped. Rod pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. His lawyer told the court he acknowledges his responsibility and desires to continue living. Sandra wept in silence. The sentence came swiftly: death. Judge Jerry Lockett, quoted by CBS News, said, "I perceive you as a disturbed young man. Your family let you down, as did society." At 17, Rod became the youngest person on death row in America.
Farrell is serving a life sentence for killing a Eustis couple back in 1996. The case got national attention because Farrell told investigators he believed he was a vampire.
Howard Scott Anderson, his closest friend and reluctant accomplice, pleaded guilty that April and was sentenced to life. Dana Cooper and Charity Kesey struck deals, 10 years for Charity, 17 for Dana. Both women have since walked free. In 2018, Anderson's sentence was reduced to 40 years. He is expected to be released at 51. Rod remained caged. In 2000, the Florida Supreme Court commuted his death sentence to life imprisonment, ruling that those under 17 could not face execution. The reprieve meant survival, but not freedom. 2 decades later, in 2020, he tried again, asking for resentencing. The court refused. The judge called him irreparably corrupt.
Do you think you deserve a second chance?
I believe all children deserve a second chance. Actually, I believe everybody in life deserves a second chance.
That same year, Jennifer Wendorf stood in the courtroom once more. The memory of what she had seen that night had never left her. The stillness of the house, the sound of her own voice breaking on the 911 call. She spoke directly to the judge, her words trembling but resolute. May I have a place that's not traumatized by looking over my shoulder? If he ever gets out, I'll be destroyed. I'll be back to that lonely little girl. Nearly 3 decades have passed since that night in Eustis. Rod Farrell remains behind bars at Tomoka Correctional Institution, still a figure of morbid fascination. But the true story is not his. It belongs to the family he destroyed, to the community left scarred, and to the uneasy question of how belief, fantasy, and neglect can twist together into something lethal. In the end, this isn't just a tale of horror. It's a mirror held up to the fragility of identity, the hunger for belonging, and the human capacity to surrender reason for myth. Some stories end with redemption. This one never had a chance.